There is a peculiar discomfort that settles over a room the moment someone refuses to fill its silence. Watch closely and you will see it. The shifting in chairs, the eyes that dart toward the quiet one as if searching for a crack, the growing urgency in everyone else's voices to compensate for what isn't being said. This discomfort is not accidental. It is the oldest tell in human interaction. We equate noise with weakness masked as confidence, and we equate silence with something we cannot measure, and what we cannot measure, we fear. For most of history, and certainly in every court, every boardroom, every family gathering, the loudest voice has been mistaken for the strongest position. This is one of the great misreadings of human nature, repeated generation after generation, because it flatters the ego of the speaker and soothes the anxiety of the listener. Noise feels like action. Noise feels like control. But if you study the men and women who actually accumulated power and kept it, not for a season but across decades, you find something else entirely. You find restraint. You find a studied, almost surgical relationship with words where each one is spent like a coin from a limited purse, never squandered on the performance of having an opinion. Consider the courtiers who surrounded any absolute monarch. The ones who talked the most, who filled every silence with commentary, who needed the room to know their thoughts on every matter. These were rarely the ones who survived a change in fortune. They had shown their hand too often. Their ambitions, their resentments, their alliances, all of it had leaked out through years of unguarded chatter. The monarch, and more dangerously the monarch's rivals, had long since mapped their psychology. But the quiet advisor, the one who spoke only when the moment demanded precision, who let others exhaust themselves in argument before offering a single well-placed observation, that advisor became indispensable, not because they knew more, though often they did, but because no one could predict them. And what cannot be predicted cannot be easily maneuvered against. This is the first psychological law beneath the power of silence. Information asymmetry is the purest form of leverage that exists between two people. Every word you speak is a piece of yourself handed to another person free of charge for them to study, catalogue, and eventually use. Speak carelessly and consistently, and you become an open book that anyone with patience can read. Withhold, and you force the other party into the exhausting, anxiety-ridden work of guessing. Human beings despise uncertainty. They will do remarkable things to resolve it, reveal their own positions prematurely, make concessions they didn't intend to make, project their own fears onto your blank expression. You do not need to manipulate anyone directly. You simply need to give them nothing to work with, and their own minds will do the rest. There is also a deeper truth here, one that touches the architecture of respect itself. We do not, in our private moments of honesty, actually admire the person who cannot stop talking. We may laugh with them, we may be entertained by them, but we do not hand them our trust. Trust is instinctively reserved for those who seem to be operating from some internal reserve of judgment, some place we cannot fully access. The silent ones create, whether deliberately or not, an aura of depth. It is a kind of psychological theatre, and like all good theatre, its power comes from what is withheld, not what is shown. A room half lit is more interesting than a room flooded with light, because the mind cannot help but fill in what it cannot see, and it almost always fills it in with something more impressive than the truth. Think of the negotiators who win the largest deals. They are rarely the ones narrating their strategy aloud. They let silence stretch after an offer is made, resisting every social instinct to soften the tension with a joke or a justification. That silence is unbearable to the other party, and unbearable silences produce movement. Someone eventually speaks to relieve the pressure, and it is almost never the disciplined one. Silence used this way is not passivity. It is one of the most active instruments available to a strategic mind. It applies pressure without appearing to apply any pressure at all, which means it cannot be resisted the way an overt demand can be resisted. You cannot argue with a person who has said nothing. But let us go further, because the power of restraint is not only about what it does to other people, it is about what it does to you. Every time you speak impulsively, you are, in a small way, surrendering control of your own mind to the emotion of the moment. Anger wants to be voiced. Insecurity wants to be soothed through explanation. Pride wants to correct the record immediately. The undisciplined person is a servant to these impulses, reacting instantly and revealing layer by layer exactly which levers move them. The disciplined person has trained themselves to feel the impulse and let it pass through them without immediate expression. This is not suppression in the unhealthy sense. It is the cultivation of a gap between stimulus and response, and in that gap lives all real power. Power over circumstance, power over other people's manipulations, and most importantly, power over your own worst instincts. History rewards this kind of patience in ways that are almost eerie in their consistency. The generals who won the longest wars were rarely the ones who charged first. They were the ones who could absorb provocation without responding to it on the provoker's timeline, who waited until the enemy had exhausted their resources through impatience and only then moved. Napoleon himself, before his fall, understood that the appearance of calm before a decisive strike was worth more than 100 cannons. His enemies, faced with his silence, would often begin to unravel their own strategy, trying to anticipate what he could not be goaded into revealing. This same principle plays out in far smaller arenas. In salary negotiations, in family disputes, in the slow erosion of office politics. The one who can wait longer, who does not need to fill the silence to feel secure, almost always ends up with the better terms. There is a reason introspective, quiet children are so often underestimated in their youth and so often surprise everyone in adulthood. They spend their early years absorbing rather than performing. While their louder peers are busy asserting themselves, competing for attention, revealing their insecurities through constant social positioning, the quiet ones are watching. They are building an internal library of human behavior. Who reacts poorly to criticism, who cannot be trusted with a secret, who needs constant validation, who will fold under pressure. By the time this knowledge matures, it becomes a form of intuition that looks, to outsiders, almost supernatural. It isn't supernatural. It is simply the compounded interest of years spent listening instead of talking. None of this should be mistaken for weakness disguised as mystery, nor should it be mistaken for the anxious silence of someone who is simply afraid to speak. There is a vast difference between strategic restraint and social paralysis, and the world is full of people who mistake one for the other. The silence that wins is not the silence of fear. It is the silence of someone who has already calculated that speaking would cost more than it would gain, and who possesses underneath that stillness a complete willingness to act decisively the moment action becomes necessary. This is crucial. The silent ones who accumulate real influence are not passive by nature. They are simply economical with their expression, saving their force for the moments when it will actually matter, rather than diluting it across 1,000 unnecessary declarations. There is also something to be said about the emotional immunity that silence grants you. When you speak less, you give critics and manipulators less raw material to twist against you. Every sentence you utter in a moment of weakness can be repeated back to you, reframed, used as ammunition long after you've forgotten you said it. The talkative person leaves a trail of vulnerabilities behind them, unknowingly arming everyone they've ever spoken carelessly to. The quiet strategist leaves almost nothing. Their opponents are left grasping at inference and assumption, which are far weaker weapons than direct quotation. If you want to understand why certain people seem to move through conflict, negotiation, and rivalry with an almost unnatural ease, stop looking at what they say and start looking at what they withhold. Watch how long they let a silence sit before responding. Watch how rarely they explain themselves unprompted. Watch how little of their internal world is available for public consumption. This is not coldness, it is architecture. They have built an internal fortress, and the walls of that fortress are made of the words they chose not to say. Cultivate this in yourself, and the shift will not be dramatic at first. It will be subtle. A pause before you answer instead of an instant reaction. A decision to let an insult go unanswered because answering it would only confirm it landed. a refusal to justify a choice that requires no justification. Over time, these small acts of restraint compound into something that begins to look, from the outside, like power, and in a very real sense, it is. Because power, at its core, has never been about who speaks the loudest in the room. It has always belonged to whoever the room cannot quite read. Every exchange between two people is, whether either party admits it or not, a transfer of information. This is the quiet mechanism beneath all human interaction, and almost no one treats it with the seriousness it deserves. When you speak, you are not simply communicating, you are handing over data. Your tone reveals your emotional state. Your word choice reveals your education, your anxieties, your allegiances. Your willingness to fill a silence reveals how much you need the approval of the person sitting across from you. None of this is theoretical. It is happening in every negotiation, every argument, every casual conversation where one person walks away having learned considerably more about the other than they gave up in return. The talkative mind believes it is asserting itself by speaking often. In truth, it is exposing itself. Each unguarded sentence becomes a data point that a patient observer can file away, and over time those data points assemble into a complete psychological map. What flatters you, what wounds you, what you're insecure about, what you'll sacrifice to avoid conflict. Once someone possesses that map, they hold a form of power over you that has nothing to do with status or resources. They simply know how to move you the way a skilled player knows the tendencies of an opponent after watching enough hands. You gave them the map for free, one unnecessary sentence at a time. Now consider the inverse. The person who withholds, who answers questions with fewer words than expected, who does not rush to fill an awkward pause, who lets a provocation sit in the air without responding to it on the provoker's schedule, gives almost nothing away. There is no map to study. There is only surface, and behind that surface, uncertainty. And here is where the deeper mechanics of influence begin to reveal themselves. Human beings are constitutionally incapable of tolerating uncertainty for long. It produces a kind of low-grade anxiety that most people will do almost anything to relieve. Faced with a silence they cannot read, they begin to fill it themselves. They offer explanations no one asked for. They make concessions to see if a reaction will finally surface. They project their own fears onto the blank space and then react to their own projection as though it were real information you provided. This is why silence functions as leverage rather than as mere absence of action. It is not a void, it is a pressure system. Think of how negotiations are actually won, not in theory, but in the tense, uncomfortable reality of the room. An offer is placed on the table, and the amateur immediately fills the ensuing quiet with justification, explaining why the number is fair, softening it before anyone has even objected. In doing so, they have already told the other side that they are uncomfortable with their own position. The seasoned negotiator does something entirely different. They state the offer and then stop. They let the silence stretch to the point of discomfort, sometimes well past it, and they let the other party sit inside that discomfort until it becomes unbearable enough that someone moves to end it. That someone is almost never the one who stayed quiet, because the quiet one has nothing left to prove and nothing further to reveal. The pressure, invisible as it is, does the negotiating for them. The same principle governs conflict far outside formal negotiation. In an argument, the person who cannot stop explaining themselves is, often without realizing it, broadcasting exactly which accusation landed. Silence in the face of an insult denies the insulter the confirmation they were fishing for. A measured, minimal response to a provocation gives an opponent no material to escalate against, no fresh grievance to seize on, nothing to quote back to you later. Meanwhile, every heated, unfiltered word spoken in anger becomes a permanent liability, repeatable, twistable, usable indefinitely by anyone who was in the room or heard about it afterward. Words, once spoken, stop belonging to you. They become the property of whoever remembers them, and they will remember the reckless ones far longer than the careful ones. There is also a strategic dimension to withholding that has nothing to do with any single interaction and everything to do with reputation over time. A person who speaks constantly becomes predictable, not simply because their opinions are known, but because the rhythm of their behavior becomes known. Everyone in their orbit learns, consciously or not, exactly how to bait a reaction out of them, exactly what flattery will move them, exactly what criticism will destabilize them. Predictability of this kind is a profound vulnerability in any environment where influence is being contested, a workplace, a family, a rivalry of any sort. The person who reveals less becomes, by simple consequence, harder to anticipate and therefore harder to manipulate. Opponents are forced to act on incomplete information, and incomplete information breeds hesitation. Hesitation, in almost every competitive arena, favors whoever is patient enough to exploit it. None of this requires deception. It requires only discretion. The recognition that not every thought needs to be spoken the instant it forms, that not every silence needs to be rescued, that the impulse to explain yourself is very often a liability dressed up as honesty. The instinct to talk more when you feel exposed is precisely backward. The moments that call for the most restraint are usually the ones where speaking would feel the most natural, because those are exactly the moments when your words carry the most information about where you are weak. Recognizing this and resisting it anyway is not coldness or manipulation in any sinister sense. It is simply an understanding, hard-won and rarely taught, that in the quiet exchange of power between two people, whoever reveals less almost always ends up controlling more. Before restraint becomes a tool you use on other people, it must first become a discipline you impose on yourself. This is the part most people skip. They see the outward behavior of the composed, unreadable individual and try to imitate the surface, the measured pause, the withheld reaction, the calm expression, without doing the internal work that makes those things genuine rather than performed. And performance, unlike mastery, cracks under pressure. The real foundation of restraint is not a technique for managing other people. It is a private, ongoing negotiation with your own impulses, conducted long before anyone else enters the room. Every strong emotion arrives with a demand attached. Anger demands to be voiced immediately, in the moment it is felt, at full volume if possible. Insecurity demands explanation, a compulsive need to clarify, to defend, to make sure the record reflects well on you. Pride demands correction the instant it senses a slight, real or imagined. These demands feel urgent, almost biological, because in a sense they are. They are old survival responses, tuned for a world of immediate physical threat, now firing in response to an email, a slight at dinner, a raised eyebrow in a meeting. The undisciplined mind treats these demands as instructions to be obeyed. The disciplined mind treats them as information to be noted, and nothing more. This distinction between an impulse obeyed and an impulse merely observed is where self-mastery actually lives. It is a small gap, often lasting only a few seconds, but everything of consequence happens inside it. In that gap, you get to ask a question the impulsive mind never bothers to ask. What does saying this actually accomplish? Not what does it feel like to say it, which is almost always satisfying in the moment, but what does it produce afterward? Most unfiltered reactions, examined honestly in that pause, reveal themselves to be about relieving your own discomfort rather than achieving anything useful. The retort that wounds someone back rarely repairs what was broken. The frantic explanation rarely convinces anyone who wasn't already inclined to believe you. The immediate correction rarely changes anyone's opinion of the mistake. It only broadcasts how much the mistake bothered you. Once you see this clearly and repeatedly, the impulse begins to lose its authority over you. You still feel it. You simply stop being ruled by it. There is a cost to skipping this internal work, and the cost is paid in exposure. A person who reacts instantly and visibly to every provocation is, without meaning to, handing out a manual on how to control them. Anyone paying attention learns quickly which comments produce anger, which questions produce defensiveness, which silences produce panic. This knowledge becomes a set of levers available to anyone willing to use them, and cruel or simply opportunistic people will use them because the lever works. Every unfiltered reaction is a small confession, This is where I am vulnerable. This is what I cannot ignore. This is the button that gets a result. The person who has trained themselves to let the impulse pass without immediate expression denies everyone this manual, not because they feel nothing, but because what they feel is no longer visible on command. This training produces something beyond mere protection, however. It produces a kind of internal architecture, a private, stable core that does not shift with every provocation or flattery thrown at it. Most people's sense of self is remarkably porous, rising and falling with the moods of whoever they last spoke to, the praise or criticism they most recently received. The person who has built genuine restraint has, in effect, built walls around that inner self. Events still register. Insults still land. Praise still feels good. But none of it immediately dictates behavior, because there is now a deliberate distance between what is felt and what is shown. This distance is not coldness. It is closer to sovereignty, the sense of governing your own responses rather than being governed by whatever just happened to you. From the outside, this internal fortress reads as depth, though it is really something closer to consistency. People are drawn, almost against their will, to those who seem unshaken by circumstances that would destabilize anyone else. It is not that they admire the absence of feeling. It is that they intuitively sense a kind of strength in someone who is not constantly reactive, someone whose behavior in a crisis resembles their behavior in calm. Someone, in other words, who can be relied upon precisely because they are not being run by whatever emotion happens to be loudest at the moment. This reliability becomes, over time, a form of authority that no title or credential can manufacture. It is earned entirely through the accumulation of moments where a reaction was possible and simply wasn't taken. It is worth being precise about what this restraint is not, because it is easy to distort into something unhealthy. It is not the suppression of feeling in the sense of pretending the feeling doesn't exist, nor is it the slow accumulation of resentment from swallowing every reaction indefinitely. Feelings acknowledged privately, processed honestly, and expressed later with intention are entirely different from feelings crushed down and denied. The goal is not to become numb. The goal is to separate the moment of feeling from the moment of expression, so that when you do choose to speak, and there will be moments that genuinely call for direct, forceful expression, it carries the full weight of a decision rather than the leaking pressure of an unmanaged impulse. Restraint, practiced properly, does not silence you permanently. It simply ensures that when you finally do speak, it is because you decided to, not because you couldn't help it. That decision, repeated consistently over years, is what eventually gets called character by everyone watching from the outside, though from the inside, it never stops being a discipline, practiced one impulse at a time.